Introduction to Biological Molecules. By the end of this lesson, you'll be able to understand the basics of biochemistry, what an atom is and how ions are formed, what oxidation and reduction are, what ionic, covalent, and hydrogen bonding are, how macromolecules are formed, what anabolism and catabolism is, and then we'll also be looking at the different groups. An atom is the smallest unit of a chemical element that can exist independently. So if you look at the structure of an atom, it's got protons, neutrons, and electrons. The neutrons don't have a charge. The protons have got a positive charge, and the electrons have a negative charge. Now you'll find a proton and a neutron in the nucleus. They both have mass. An electron, on the other hand, spins in orbitals around the nucleus, and the electron's mass is so small that it's negligible. Here's another way of looking at an atom. You can see the protons and neutrons are in the nucleus. It's surrounded by electrons that are spinning in orbitals around the nucleus. So the electrons have got negative charges, the proton's positive, and the neutron's neutral. Now, the charge of an atom is usually neutral. This means that the number of protons, the positive charges, equals the number of electrons, the negative charges. Remember that neutrons don't have a charge. If you look at the mass of an atom, we say that the mass of an atom is the number of protons plus the number of neutrons. So it's the total number of protons and neutrons. Remember that electrons' masses are so small that it's negligible. So if you look at carbon, carbon's got 6 protons and 6 neutrons, so we say that its mass is 12. Now, how do we form ions? Ions are formed when an atom either loses an electron or gains an electron. So if we look at sodium here, the structure of sodium has, in its outer shell, so in the outer orbital, it's only got 1 electron. Do you think that sodium can easily lose an electron or easily gain lots of electrons? Now, for an atom to be stable, its outer shell or outer orbital needs to be full. And in order for this to happen, the atom can either lose an electron or gain electrons. So in this case, sodium's only got 1 electron, so it's easier for sodium to lose the electron. Now, if sodium loses the electron, it's losing a negative charge. This means that the number of protons will be greater than the number of electrons, so the overall charge will be positive. So we say that sodium atom loses an electron, so it's lost a negative charge. This means that the ion of sodium is now positive. What about chlorine? Chlorine's got 7 electrons in its outer shell. It only needs 1 more electron to become stable. So do you think it's easier for chlorine to lose 7 electrons or to gain 1 electron? It's obviously easier for chlorine to gain an electron. So chlorine gains an electron, it's gaining a negative charge. So it's got 1 more negative charge than it had before. So we say that chlorine atom, when it gains an electron, forms a chloride ion. So its outer shell or outer orbital is full, and it's gained an electron in order for this to happen, so it's formed a negative ion. Now, what is oxidation and reduction? An easy way to remember oxidation and reduction is oil rig. Oxidation is the loss of electrons, and reduction is the gain of electrons. So if you look here, you've got a neutral atom. If it loses an electron, so it's losing a negative charge, it's going to form a positively charged ion, which we call a cation. If it gains electrons, it forms an anion, a negatively charged ion. So we say that when it loses an electron, remember oxidation is loss of electrons, that atom has been oxidized. So oxidation has occurred. If it gains electrons, we say that reduction has occurred. So how do you remember the difference between oxidation and reduction? Well, if you look at oxidation's got O in it and reduction's got E in it. So the change of electrons in oxidation, it loses electrons. In reduction, it receives electrons. The atom becomes oxidized in oxidation and reduced in reduction. The ion produced is positive in oxidation and negative in reduction. And the first vowel to remember is O and E. Now let's have a look at different bonding. You've got covalent bonding, ionic bonding, and hydrogen bonding. Covalent bonding usually occurs between nonmetals, and this is when two nonmetals, for example, two hydrogen, come together and they want their outer shell to be full. So what they do is they share electrons with one another. So atoms share a pair of electrons, so the outer shell is filled. This means that each atom is now more stable. And so for example, if you have two hydrogen, they come together, they share the electrons, you now have a molecule of hydrogen forming. What about carbon? Well, carbon's got 4 electrons in its outer shell. So for carbon to become stable, it needs 4 other electrons in order to fill up its outer shell. So where does it get these other 4 electrons from? Well, each hydrogen can give 1 electron, so carbon can join with 4 hydrogen. So the hydrogen come along and they say to the carbon, we'll share electrons with you, and they form covalent bonds. So carbon forms 4 covalent bonds with hydrogen. And when you draw it, you draw straight lines to represent the bonds. Ionic bonding is when a metal joins with a non-metal. And how does this happen? Well, you've got a metal. The metal, for example, sodium, has got 1 electron in its outer shell. For it to become stable, it needs to lose that 1 electron. So it says to chlorine, I'll give you 1 electron. So sodium gives up its electron and it forms a positive ion. So it forms Na+. Chlorine gains an electron from sodium, so it forms a chloride ion. Now these two attract one another. So ions with opposite charges attract each other, and these electrostatic attractions are known as ionic bonds. Ionic bonds are weaker than covalent bonds, but they are stronger than hydrogen bonds. What about hydrogen bonding? If you've got water, water is made up of H2O. This means that oxygen is covalently bonded to 2 hydrogen atoms. Now the oxygen atom is much bigger than the hydrogen atoms. This means that oxygen is going to have more of a pull on those electrons compared to the hydrogen atoms. So electrons within a molecule are not evenly distributed, but tend to group at one position. For example, in water, oxygen is much bigger. It's got more of a pull on those electrons compared to hydrogen. This means that oxygen is going to form what we call a delta negative charge. Hydrogen, on the other hand, it's still sharing electrons with oxygen, but the electrons are drawn more towards the oxygen. So hydrogen is going to have a slightly positive charge, so we say it's delta positive. This means that a molecule of water has got a slightly negative charge on the oxygen and slightly positive charges on the hydrogen. So if one water molecule comes in contact with another water molecule, the hydrogen, which is a slightly positive charge, will be attracted to the oxygen, which has a slightly negative charge. And this attraction is called hydrogen bonding. So a molecule with an uneven distribution of charge is called a polar molecule. And the negative region, for example, on the oxygen of one molecule, can attract the positive region of another molecule. So hydrogen bonding can occur between 2 water molecules, and hydrogen bonding is weak. But if there's lots of hydrogen bonding, for example, in water, it can change the physical properties of that substance. Now let's have a look at polymerization and the formation of macromolecules. Molecules can be linked together to form chains of similar subunits. For example, you've got the carbons here, and they can form a long chain of a carbon backbone. These chains form large molecules called macromolecules. We also call them polymers. And the process of forming polymers is called polymerization. So, if you look here, you've got monosaccharides form polysaccharides, organic bases form nucleotides, which form nucleic acids, and monosaccharides are also involved in forming nucleotides. Amino acids form proteins, and fatty acids and glycerol form lipids. What about condensation and hydrolysis? What is the difference? Well, condensation reactions involve subunits joining together. So when they join together, for example, you've got these 4 blue subunits. When they join together, water is released. So each time a new subunit is attached during polymerization, water is formed. So reactions that produce water are called condensation reactions. What about hydrolysis reactions? It's the opposite. If you have a macromolecule and it gets broken down into its subunits, you need water. So polymers are broken down through the addition of water. Water molecules break down the bonds that link the subunits of a polymer, and this is called hydrolysis. So water is used to break down the molecule. It's used to hydrolyze those bonds. So you have a macromolecule, water is used to hydrolyze those bonds, and the macromolecule is broken down into the simple subunits. Metabolism. All the chemical processes that take place in living organisms are collectively called metabolism. Metabolism can be divided into 2 parts. You've got anabolism on the left and catabolism on the right. So if you look here, you can see that anabolism is the building up and catabolism is the breaking down. So anabolism is an energy requiring process in which small molecules are combined to make larger ones. The condensation reactions that build polymers from basic subunits, for example, polypeptides formed from amino acids, are examples of anabolic reactions. Catabolism releases energy. So chemical reactions involving the release of energy and the breakdown of larger molecules into smaller ones is called catabolism. So the hydrolysis reactions are examples of catabolism. Now we're going to have a look at the different groups. So alcohol has got an OH group attached to it. So it's usually a carbon group with an OH group attached to it. So what is the difference between a primary, secondary and tertiary alcohol? Well, if you look at that carbon, the COH, you're going to look at which other carbons are attached to that carbon. So for example, you've got 1 carbon attached to that middle carbon. We say that it's a primary alcohol. If you've got 2 carbons attached to that middle carbon, we say it's a secondary alcohol. And then 3 carbons is a tertiary alcohol. So I want you to copy these down in your notes. Primary, secondary and tertiary alcohols. What is a carboxyl group? Well, carboxyl group has got C double bond O, OH, so it's got an acidic group attached to it. Then you've got something called a carbonyl group. Carbonyl oxygen is attached to the carbonyl carbon, so it's a C double bond O. Now this C double bond O can be attached to X and Y. If Y is a hydrogen and R is, say, a carbon, we call that an aldehyde. So if the C double bond O has got a hydrogen attached to it, we say it's an aldehyde. A ketone, on the other hand, has got 2 R groups, which can be carbons, long chains of carbons. We call that a ketone. So look at the difference between an aldehyde and a ketone and copy these down in your notes. Now, what is the difference between saturated and unsaturated when we talk about bonds? Well, carbon, if there are no double bonds, so they're just single bonds, it is said to be saturated. Unsaturated means that there's one or more double bonds. Polyunsaturated means there are multiple double bonds. So look at the difference between saturated and unsaturated. And lastly, acids and bases. If you put an acid in water, it's going to dissociate, and you've got hydrogen ions inside the water. This will lower the pH. So an acid will lower the pH of water, and we say that it dissociates into hydrogen ions. A base, if you put in water, will form a basic solution, an alkaline solution. And if you combine an acid with a base, they form water. So an acid plus a base, H plus OH minus forms water, H2O. So what have we learned in this lesson? We've understood the basics of biochemistry. So what is an atom? Remember, an atom's got protons, neutrons, and electrons in it. How are ions formed? So if an atom loses an electron or gains an electron, it forms either a negative or positive ion. What is oxidation and reduction? Oxidation is the loss of electrons and reduction is the gain of electrons. What is an ionic, covalent, and hydrogen bonding? Ionic is between a metal and non-metal, and remember that if you have different charged ions, they'll attract one another. So this is ionic bonding. Covalent bonding involves the sharing of electrons, and hydrogen bonding would be an example of water where there's an uneven distribution of electrons within the molecule. So the molecule have a slight charge even though there's covalent bonding. We looked at hydrolysis and condensation, and then we looked at the difference between anabolism and catabolism. Remember that anabolism is the building up and catabolism is the breaking down. We also discussed the different groups, aldehyde, ketone, carboxyl, to name a few. And that concludes our lesson. The end.